in our home, all the meat curries are always made with some vegetable. It's never potato. So we put tori or we put bengan or arvi or peta as an integral part of Christmas cake. So there are these little nuances which draw from other communities as well. So there's this thing about meat curries with vegetable is a very Muslim sort of style of cooking.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of Curious Appetite. We at Zaikanama are starting this interview series where we invite experts who will be talking about various aspects of food, history and culture. और आज हम जिस टॉपिक पे बात करने वाले हैं वो है food in fiction. Food and festivities have provided some of the literature's most memorable moments. And our guest today is Madhulika Liddle. She is a novelist and an award-winning short story writer. She is known mostly for her writing historical fiction, her latest novel, The Garden of Heaven, being the first book in a 4-part series called the Delhi Quartet. Madhulika lives in Noida and blogs about classic cinema, travel and food. Food is also the focus of her first non-fiction book, Lockdown Lunches, which arose out of a project to explore world cuisines while sitting at home through the pandemic. Hello, ma'am. How are you?
Hello, how are you? And thank you so much for inviting me here. This is an interview I really been looking forward to because food fascinates me so much. So thank you very much for having me here. Thank you.
Our pleasure, ma'am. We've been looking forward to this ourselves. Thank you for taking our time. So just diving right into it. What do you enjoy most about food in literature? What do you think it brings to what we are reading?
I think, I've come to the conclusion that most people to some extent or the other are interested in food. Like for instance, if I post a picture of a pretty flower or a pretty bird on Instagram or Facebook, I will get maybe 10 likes or 15 likes or whatever. I post a picture of a nice looking dish and I have flooded and people are very interested. Oh, I had something like this and I make something like this. My dadi made something like this. So there is this sort of enthusiasm about food, which is, I think, pretty much universal. There are very few people who are not at all interested in food, So I think when that sort of enthusiasm comes through in what I'm reading also, it can it can trigger things. And sometimes there are, you come across something in fiction and what you're reading, which triggers a memory for yourself.
Right.
It's a sort of a shared connect between the writer and the reader. That okay, this is something I also, I sort of relate to. So it could be a childhood memory, or it could be, some sort of food which I go to when I'm, upset or in need of comfort or something. So food, I think, plays an important part in binding the writer and the reader together. So of course, it has to be worked in well. But I think that is one thing which fiction can do when it comes to food.
And we are always so curious about what the other person is eating. And it's almost rude to stare at someone reading. It's culturally just frowned upon, but one can get away while reading in books completely.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
You're observing that private moment and you are, it's part of the story and all of that. So I just wanted to know, do you think, as a writer, do you think one can use food and culinary references to spring up a passage or a scene, even though the book might not be of the food fiction genre?
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, I have, if I look back at the sort of books I read, for instance, one thing which is very important is that we spend a bit of our time every day eating. And what happens over a meal, especially if suppose you're sitting with somebody else, the sort of conversations that can happen over a meal can be very interesting. And that is the sort of thing which I see a lot of in books, the sort of the conversations over meals. For instance, you look at, say, Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle in the Sherlock Holmes stories actually has several stories which have food as an important part.
Right.
So, for instance, there's the story called The Blue Carbuncle. in which there's a precious stone which is stuffed inside a goose at the Christmas for the Christmas feast. Similarly, Agatha Christie has a story called The Christmas Pudding, where something similar happens. It's put inside a Christmas pudding, and there is Roald Dahl, for instance. Roald Dahl, of course, is in a different category because he wrote a lot about food. But one of his most interesting short stories, which I like a lot, is actually uses food as a weapon.
Yeah.
So, A Lamb to the Slaughter is about a woman who kills her husband by whacking him on the head with a frozen leg of lamb. So I think, fiction can marry really well with food. P.G. Wodehouse, who is not known for writing about food, he's a humorist, has this very interesting chef called Anatole, who is a French chef and who is very temperamental, but makes fabulous food. And those menus are detailed in Woodhouse's books. And I'm like, always when I read those, I'm like, oh, I want to eat Anatole's cooking. So it does not need to be a food novel, but food can still play an important part in it. I mean, it can play literally an important part, as I mentioned in the poems or the Christie or the Roald Dahl stories. But it can also generally help build up atmosphere, and it can sort of give you an idea of what is happening around, in that space. So, for instance, I was recently reading this James Joyce's Dubliners, and there is one very splendid story of his at the end of it called The Death. And that's all set around a Christmas party in Dublin. So, you get a taste of what Dublin was like in, say, the early 20th century. So, food is a very good way of showing a space. It's a very good descriptive in that way.
And also to build up characters, what class they come from, what their life must be like, their preferences, taste. I think these are some very interesting details that come up. They make the characters more rounded. So, what are if I were to ask you, your most favorite food references in literature that has stayed on with you, that has probably maybe shaped your adult taste to an extent, that made you curious for a certain cuisine or a food, and that always makes you hungry whenever you read about it?
There are some books which actually make me hungry just by thinking about the book. I don't even need to read it again. So one of those is, it's a very famous book, Laura Esquivel's Like Water for Chocolate, which is about Mexican cuisine. And that, just the thought of it makes my mouth water. Then there is a somewhat little known book called Pomegranate Soup. It's by this lady called Marsha Mehran. And it is about three sisters who flee Iran and how they settle in, I think the UK it was or something. And they set up their own little Iranian restaurant. And, it's about how they're using food to sort of keep tied to their old home in Iran, and yet to sort of blend in with the new people they're in, because they're amongst these whites who sort of regard them with suspicion and who regard their food with suspicion. So how these women are trying to find their way. So that is one book. And then there is this nice book by Nicole Mons, which is called The Last Chinese Chef, which was a fantastic insight into Chinese cooking. And that was like really lovely, and especially because it's not just sort of home food, it's about a chef. So some of it is fairly fancy, but some of it is, sort of pretty rustic as well. So it was a nice combination of different types of Chinese cuisine. There are various short stories which I like a lot. Roald Dahl is one, Lamb to the Slaughter. That's not very food oriented, but yeah, food plays a major part in it. There is another story by Roald Dahl called Taste, which is set all around a wine tasting happening at a dinner party. Again, it's more about wine, but there is
I remember
sort of
that full suspense built up, and the marriage is at stake.
Yes, exactly. And there's another story which I'm actually very intrigued by, because I don't know who wrote this story. It's a story about a French chef who is, he has a cat, and he's very fond of the cat, and the cat is like his dear pet. And this chef, he has this little restaurant, but he does not have a Michelin star. And one day he receives a sort of anonymous letter that a Michelin food taster is coming to your area today, and this is your chance. And how everything goes wrong and what he does, and he loses his entire staff in the course of one afternoon, and it is a disaster. And he kicks his cat, and all sorts of things happen. Now and this story has like really really interesting and very mouth-watering food references. And the funny thing is that the same story was written in two versions, by this American author called Paul Gallico, and one by John Steinbeck. And the interesting thing is, one of these two plagiarized the story. So I have no idea who did it. So, but it's a great story. So well, those are some of my food references which I really like in literature.
One of my favorite food references was in a short story, and I kind of never really got a closure from it. It is such a strange story. I picked up this book from a railway station at the Wheelers, and it was short stories written by mostly Bengali people of Bengali origin, and there was a story which still haunts me. It's called the Gondoraj Limbu. It's a special kind of a lemon which is very popular in Bengali culinary spread. And the entire story goes that the head of the family, father, is really, really sick. And he's not going to make it. And he has 4 sons. And the mother is really distraught. And so if once she becomes a widow, because she's a high caste Brahmin, Bengali Brahmin, she will not be allowed non-vegetarian food. So her sons decide that let us throw one big feast for her. Let's just organize this one big feast for her. And there are food descriptions of these really elaborate, mouth-watering Bengali dishes, right? And they've been cooking all day, from where the ingredients are coming, how the Maharaj is going about cooking them. And finally, everybody sits down to eat that. And everything is laid down, and there's description of different kind of fishes and meats and vegetables and all of that, and how it is being laid out and how she's looking at it. She's really tired. She's exhausted with grief, but looking at that food, she wants to eat it. And suddenly she remembers that she wants a slice of a lemon. Then she asks someone, can you go and get it for her? And they thought of everything, but they didn't think of that lemon. So then you have one of the servants running to the back of the house, where the tree is, to get that particular lemon. And then the news comes, he's passed away. The father has passed away, and she cannot eat that elaborate meal. And it was heartbreaking. And, one has that, I never got a closure from it. I never could find that book again. And I don't know where that book is. And it still haunts me. The description of this particular story, the food in it. So ma'am, you've written historical fiction. How much of food features in the lives of the characters in your book? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It depends. I usually do like to put in some idea of what the food was like, because I think a lot of Indians don't realize we have this whole thing about the food is authentic, the food is traditional and all that. But what we don't realize is that a lot of the traditional food is actually not completely, it's not as if these recipes are like coming from antiquity. Some are, but a lot of things, like for instance, we don't even realize that potatoes, peanuts were not even here until like say 400 years ago, because it was not until the new world was discovered and the Columbian exchange happened that these ingredients came our way. So if we say that an aloo dum or an aloo posto or all our mirchi wali cheezein and tomato wali cheezein are like sort of antiquity se chali aa rahi hain, that is not true. So I like to sort of explore what food was like also through fiction, because it's a good way of showing. You show sort of clothing, and you show monuments or things like that. So why not also show food? Because food is such an integral part of our lives. So if you are trying to show what people lived like in say 1400 or whatever, it's important to also show what they ate. And if you have sort of a story which is showing somebody in, say, I remember reading this story set in ancient India where somebody was eating a chili rich curry with chicken and potatoes in it, and I wanted to say potato nahi tha, chili nahi tha, so there's so much we take for granted. I mean, people drinking tea. We don't realize that tea was not an important part of Indian life till very, very recently. And it was not until well into the 20th century that the tea board actually began this whole campaign about popularizing chai. So, so yeah, when I write historical fiction, I do like to write something about the food back then.
Right. So, what kind of resources do you consult when you're going into these little details about your characters?
Mostly it is one book, and that is this really good book by Colleen Taylor Sen called Feast and Fasting, which is a history of Indian cooking. So, and it's really an eye opener because you realize how much we take for granted, which is not actually Indian. It's not sort of ancient Indian type. So that is my main reference. But yeah, depending on what I'm writing about, sometimes I look at other books also. So for instance, when I was doing the Muzaffar Jung series, which is set in 17th century, I looked at this very interesting book by Salma Haider or Salma Hussain, I forgot what. It's called The Emperor's Table. So which is about a history of Mughal food, which is also very interesting because, when you look at the early emperors, their food is very, very influenced by Persian food. It's in fact, it's very much like Persian food. Whereas by the time you come to say Shah Jahan, it's become very recognizable for us today. It's become recognizable as sort of a Mughlai food.
But still very different from what we understand as Mughlai food.
Exactly.
Now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's true.
And when you one goes through those recipes, one realizes so many of the food ingredients are not used. Like chili, of course, being one of them, but not a lot of haldi is also being used. And
exactly.
garlic is also being used very sparingly, and it is
very sparingly.
Yeah, it's
and even the whole sort of essence of how food is made. For instance, I remember there was this recipe for a bengan ka omelette, which is like it is nothing. I can't think of any sort of similarities in Indian food now. And yet it was made in India.
I also remember coming across these recipes, the khaginas, the ones that are inspired by the Persian side. They use a lot of these sweet and tart elements in these egg preparation. Also, a lot of the dishes I don't think we can appreciate now. From the Mughal is something called a mutanjan. It's not really made in our part of the subcontinent so much, but I think it is made in Pakistan and Bangladesh a lot. Just the sheer amount of sugar which is used with rice, the quantities that they also use these orange marmalades, it's just too rich. I don't think family we have the palate our palate has also changed so much over the years. So ma'am, you have written 2 food fiction novels. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Actually, both the novels are still unpublished. One of them is going to be published hopefully within the next year or so. That is called, it's tentatively about apricots. So it's a sort of a romantic story. It's like a rom-com. It's set in the Kumaon mountains, and it's about a woman who runs a sort of co-op NGO sort of thing where she sort of, along with the local village women, she makes pickles and chutneys and stuff like that. And she falls in love with this man who has just become the owner of an apricot orchard without really knowing anything about it. So that's, and sort of pickles especially are a very important part of the whole story. And apricots, of course, are an important part of. So that is one book. And the other one is something which is actually very close to my heart. It's with the publisher right now. I don't know whether they will accept it or not. It's set in 1962, and the protagonist is a North Indian Christian woman who comes to Delhi after she gets married and suddenly finds herself a widow. And she's on her own, and she's very well off. So it's not as if she needs to sort of actually work, but she looks at work for, in a way of trying to keep herself occupied. And she stumbles across a food stall, which she eventually takes up. and she sort of starts cooking, and the food she cooks is the food she knows, which is North Indian Christian food, which is like that's the food I grew up eating, and it's the sort of food I cook a lot. And a lot of people who are not of the community don't realize what sort of food we eat. So, like for instance, in our home, all the meat curries are always made with some vegetable. So it's never potato. It's never potato. So we put tori, or we put bengan, or arvi, or whatever, So those are the sort of things. And like our cakes are always Christmas cake is always made with petha, must be there. Petha is an integral part of Christmas cake. And so there are these little nuances which draw from other communities as well. So there's this thing about meat curries with vegetable is a very Muslim sort of style of cooking. So so I wanted to do a book which was about this sort of cooking.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this Christmas cake that you're talking about? I'm finding it absolutely fascinating, because only other reference I know of petha in a cake is the Allahabad Christmas cake, which is in the Anglo-Indian colonies over there. And there's a particular bakery that does it, and they also put orange marmalade in it, and the baking spices, really.
So, this is the cake recipe I have, which I use every year, is it came down to me from my nani. And it is like, it's much older than her also, of course. And it's a pound cake. So you begin with your eggs and butter, sugar and butter. Then you add your eggs, and there is a lot of fruit added. And the fruit is never soaked. It's never soaked in rum, whiskey, anything. So it's always added as it is. And you add the basic, sort of mixed candied peel, candied fruit, raisins, candied ginger is always added, walnuts, and petha. Petha not very much is added, but a little bit, and it's the plain white dry petha. So that is added, and then you always add a lot of spice. So we always add mace, nutmeg, cloves, and cardamom. So these 4 spices are added. It tastes very nice. And I mean, I've eaten a lot of cakes. I've eaten a lot of Christmas cakes, and I still say that this one is my favorite one, because the spice is the main thing. It makes it really delicious. And right at the end, you add, just before you put it in, you add brandy or whiskey. So it's a fantastic cake.
So it always used to be made at home, because I had a friend who grew up in Kanpur, and she would tell me there would be these community bakers where you go there with your ingredients and they just bake it for you.
So, that's how in fact most of my family does it. So they used to buy these huge quantities. You buy all the ingredients, you take all your cake dabbas, you take it to the baker, and he is the one who, you go in the morning, you get it all done in front of you. Sort of he mixes it and everything and puts it into the oven. And then, because it's a pound cake, so it takes a long time to bake. It takes 2 to 3 hours. So there used to be, sort of uncles and cousins, male cousins who used to be told, "Wahan baitho, 3 घंटे बैठो, जब वो निकालेगा." Then only sort of wait until the cake thins have cooled a little bit. Then my mother tells me how there used to be this huge sort of trunk, steel trunk. They used to put all the cake things into that and then bring that home. But that was because you had these joint families. So you had lots of people at home to eat the cakes. And then you also had a lot of people coming home and you're giving cakes to people, gifting cakes to people. It's like Diwali ki mithai.
I'm going to be dreaming about that for a long time. I feel the food description in children's book is another genre in itself, right? So what are your favorite food references of the books that you grew up reading?
Unfortunately,
there's so much more.
Unfortunately, my only reference is Enid Blyton. So I remember all those scones and the cakes and things which were very alien to us. I mean, but I still remember them. And the funny thing is that I'm seeing my daughter. She is she's reading Enid Blyton and she's making plans. Okay, we will go there. We will go for a picnic, and we will carry lemonade, and we will carry ham sandwiches, and we will carry scones. I said, "Beta, yahan pe bahut mushkil hai." So those were actually my main, what I remember most of from when I was a child. I didn't read too much. I didn't read too much Indian fiction. So the only thing I remember was I have this vivid memory of reading a story set it was in Target. And Target was the children's magazine which used to come out back then. And it was great fun. Those are my memories.
We also used to, I remember reading these book called Nandan and Chanda Mama. These were children's Hindi literary books that used to, magazines rather, they used to come out. Again, railway stations, dealers, that's where you pick them up. And there's this recurring theme of food that appears out of nowhere, or you touch something and it turns into food. And even in Enid Blyton books, there is always this reference that enough food to go around. There's this whole idea of abundance that she talks about again and again. And the fascinating thing, like what you're saying, alien food, we don't know what it tastes like, but it is just described in such a mouth-watering manner that we just greedy for it.
Yeah.
I mean, the first time I actually saw scones, I was very disappointed because that's not how I imagined them to be. I don't know, for some reason, this is what it is. The dry, crumbly sort of a bread, but yeah, the trickle and that ginger beer, and these are the things we didn't have. And of course, now, for example, the Harry Potter books also has references to a lot of these weird fictional food that
and some of sounds very disgusting.
Some of it very, very disgusting. And there are these some channels on YouTube. There's some people who recreate these fictional meals. Yeah, I just discovered them recently, and it is quite fascinating actually. The Turkish delights and a lot of these references from Harry Potter books. These magical foods that appear. They imagine what it would taste like, and they put together ingredients. So I thought, okay, there are these whole bunch of people who are there to try out. Also, remember these Eat Me cookies from Alice in Wonderland.
Yes.
Yeah, Alice in Wonderland. And of course, this Anne of Green Gables. I always wondered about these raspberry cordial that got her drunk. She was not supposed to drink that.
Yeah.
I have never tasted raspberry cordial, but I used to. Are there any fictional food that comes to your mind that you think you would like to try, or like something that sounded like really weird? Anything that comes to your mind?
Butterbeer. So that is I always think of it as something like sort of caramel, buttery, butterscotch sort of thing,
That's what it is. I was actually looking at certain recipes of butterbeer. Like people are actually, children are quite obsessed with it, and it's being made, and people are consuming it. They're actually recreating it at home. So, any book that comes to your mind that captures a food culture that you're very familiar with, that something which was all about home, which was comforting, reading about it was comforting, the food that was familiar to you?
Actually, I don't think I've ever come across something which was like really, because not too many Indians have written food novels. I've come across short stories, but again, I don't think I've come across too many short stories about, that much about Indian food. But I'll talk about two novels which I really like, and which are, as far as I know, the only Indian food novels written in English. One is Andali Bajit's More Than Just Biryani, and the other is Sandeepa Mukherjee's Those Delicious Letters. So, More Than Just Biryani is about how Muslim cuisine is not just biryani. So it's about these women and they're related, and about how food plays a part in their lives. I found that really fascinating. It was a wonderfully written book, and the food was, oh God, it was so good. I wanted to sort of grab that book and just make everything in it. It was so delicious. And then Sandeepa Mukherjee's Those Delicious Letters. That's a very light-hearted sort of book, but it's about this woman who is she's Bengali, and she and her husband and children, they live in the US. And one day, out of the blue, she starts receiving letters from some lady in Kolkata who sort of passes on recipes to her, tells her that these are, sort of my family recipes, and I know you will want to keep these and stuff like that. And the heroine is like very mystified. She doesn't know who this old lady is, and she herself is not a very good or a very accomplished cook. So she's a little puzzled, and she's a little daunted by, should I even try doing these recipes? recipes. And then she gradually gets pulled into this whole thing and she starts making recipes. And again, Sandeepa, of course, has written this really good cookbook on Bengali food. And she manages to bring those same recipes, the essence of Bengali food. I'm very fond of Bengali food. My mother's half Bengali. So Bengali food is like right up my alley. And I love this book. I was like, wow. It really made my mouth water. So yeah, these two books are like sort of familiar to me, and both of them I love. I wish more Indians would write food novels.
I know. I feel the same. I feel the same about movies. Now we have started focusing on food. There have been certain movies. I've been told that Malayalam cinema has a lot of food references in most of their movies. Not so much our mainstream Hindi movies that we have grown up watching, right? So I am obsessed with your Facebook posts, especially when you were talking about people who kind of bombard you with questions and reactions whenever you post about food. I am one of them. So whenever you post about food, I'm the one, this looks fabulous, and what is this and how did you make it? So there is a book which we mentioned in the introduction that has come out of your experiences of cooking during the pandemic, lockdown lunches. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, that happened because as a family, my husband, I, and my daughter, she's now 8 years old, she was 6 when the lockdown started. We are very fond of going out and trying new restaurants and all that. So what happened was, one of the major fallouts of the lockdown was that suddenly we were not going out to any restaurants. And even though I make a fairly, sort of eclectic range of food at home, by about 2 months into the lockdown, we were like very sick of eating ghar ka khana day in, day out. So one day in May, I decided, okay, let's do something new. Let's do a little French party. That was mainly because cherries were in season, and every time when cherries are in season, I make cherry clafouti. And cherry clafouti is like, I said, chalo bhai, May hai, cherries had also come. So I said, I'm making cherry clafouti. Let's do an entire French party. So I'll do a French appetizer, I'll do a French main course, something to drink, and we'll play French music, we'll pretend we've gone to a French restaurant. So we did that. And, it was a big hit. It was a big hit with everybody at home. And when it finished, my daughter was like, why is it finished? Why is it finished? I said, okay, we'll do another one sometime. So 2 weeks later, I said, okay, let's do an Italian party. So I did that. And what I would do was that I made it into this entire, every 2 weeks, we did one new country. And always, my husband would make the playlist and I would make all the food, and we would have a lot of fun basically. And I used to post this on Facebook. I used to post photos. I used to talk about the food, and I used to post links to the recipes. And many people started telling me, please, please, please write a book. So first I was not inclined. I said, there's so many cookbooks out there. Then I said, okay, chalo, let's do it. It's Lockdown Lunches is a memoir of 26 lunches cooked across 1 year. So one every 2 weeks. So it's a lot about what we did. My daughter's responses to the food, the way we tried to show her culture through food. So we tried to introduce her to different aspects of culture through the food of a country. So, for instance, I remember when we did South Africa, for instance, we tried to tell her what apartheid was all about and how, interestingly, food is connected to apartheid. For instance, the very famous bunny chow, which is basically a loaf of bread which is hollowed out and curry stuffed into it. It was a way of evading the rule that people who were colored could not go into a restaurant. So if you wanted to eat outside food, you went to the back door of the restaurant. You were given this thing which looks actually from the outside looks like a loaf of bread. So it's not cooked food, So it was an interesting experience for all of us, because besides being able to eat sort of different food and refreshingly different food, every 2 weeks. It helped us understand a lot of countries which we didn't know very much about. So that's what lockdown lunches is, and suppose it's got all the recipes in it, which are all of them are tweaked to sort of to suit our palates as well as to suit what was available then. Because when we were deep in the lockdown, there were times when I could not even get an interesting piece of sort of I couldn't get an interesting bread, for instance. So I baked my own bread. So all those sort of things, and it was a lot of fun. So that's what the book is about. Right now, it's just an e-book because I've not given it to any publisher. I published it on Kindle. So that's it.
It's on Amazon. It's
yeah,
on Kindle. Yes. So, what kind of research went into you trying to curate a menu? How did you decide what you're going to make for a particular country's culinary culture?
Okay, so I had some criteria in mind. One was that it should be something which the child should eat. She is fortunately she is quite adventurous that way. She doesn't have these big hang-ups about I will not eat this, I will not eat that. So that was one thing. Secondly, it had to be something like the ingredients had to be readily available. There was one time when I could not get any alcohol because we were stuck at home, and of course you can't order alcohol online. So those sort of considerations also. Plus, while we are very fond of eating and all, we try and make sure that our meals are very nutritionally balanced. So, I would only have, say, one non-vegetarian dish in the entire meal. Everything else would be vegetarian. And while in India that is fairly easy to do because we have so many vegetarian dishes, there are some countries where it was so difficult to find vegetarian options. So those were some of the things I did, and of course, basically almost all my research was done online. There were some countries like, say, the UK or France or Italy, where I had books also which I could refer to, which I had books at home. So I referred to those, but basically it was a lot of it came through bloggers, because there are lots of people who are like, say, either from a diaspora or they live in, say, sort of English-speaking countries or something, and they are blogging about food. And it's so interesting to sort of see the same recipe in put up by 10 different people, and they have 10 different versions of the same thing. So it's interesting to be able to find your own way through that and say, okay, I think this works for me. So yeah, that was how it happened.
Right. And if I could ask you, what was this one dish that you really enjoyed cooking and it really surprised you in terms of, how different it was with the familiar ingredients that you could rustle?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And, there were so many times when the ingredients were very familiar and you find them in the unlikeliest of places. For instance, I found a dal soup in Papua New Guinea, and it's made with moong ki dal, sort of your regular yellow moong ki dal. That's made with that, and with ingredients that are not at all exotic. Or, for instance, when you see a very familiar dish made halfway across the world. So, for instance, in Tanzania, there was this dish which was called maharagwe, which is basically it's a rajma. It's a rajma curry. It has the regular rajma, the onions, the garlic, the tomato, everything. It even has curry powder added to it, and it has coconut milk, which is fantastic. And you see across East Africa, of course, there's a definite Indian influence. So that was, it's interesting.
What was your daughter's favorite meal that she completely lapped up and she loved? If you had to tell us about one meal that she absolutely loved.
I don't know, because for pretty much every meal she said, this was my favorite, this was my favorite. I think she liked the Indian one very much, and she liked the American one a lot. American one, I think basically because I made apple pie, and she'd been after me for a long time, apple pie, I want to eat apple pie, which I think came out of having read about apple pie in children's books. So, make apple pie.
That's lovely. And so, I mean, this conversation can go on forever. So, do you plan on continuing this lockdown, not knockdown anymore, but would you
Unlocked.
unlocked. Would you be recreating? Are you thinking of it? I'm sure it takes up a lot of
Yes.
energy, and now everything is
Yeah,
open up. You can go out. Do you think, because we love reading about it?
actually, I've already done 19 other countries.
Right.
So in fact, I'm thinking of doing another lunch next weekend. So I think there will be a sequel to it.
What are you cooking next weekend?
Thai.
Hi.
Thai food. So my daughter, her tolerance for chili is very low. So we've been telling her for a long time, you better get used to eating chili. So you get a sort of trial run at Thai. So let's see.
Ma'am, it's been lovely talking to you. I just really enjoyed this conversation, and uh, I'm looking forward to reading more about your experiments with food and cuisine and all of that and more.
Thank
And of
you
course,
so much.
your lockdown lunches. I have followed it on Facebook, but I'm looking forward to reading it all over again.
Thank
Thank you
you
so
so
much.
much. I had a lovely time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.